Hello, and Tom Níla Fátarov Ella. You're all very welcome to this EM Ireland webinar with our colleagues in the UN representations in Brussels on EU careers, specifically with the UN, of course. And we'll tell you a bit about our work in EM Ireland on EU jobs as well. We're delighted to have co-organised it with colleagues Niall and Saorlaith, who I'll introduce shortly, and delighted to be joined by all of you. Almost 400 of you registered, and I see many logged in, and hopefully more we'll watch back afterwards. Delighted to say we're recording today's event, so just to be conscious of that. And at any point, if you wish to watch it back, it'll be available on our EMI player at europeanmovement.ie, or of course on our YouTube channel. So to go around the table, you'll see Mr. Niall McCann, who is Policy Advisor with the Legal Identity of the UN Development Programme Office in Brussels. And Niall provides programming and advisory support to the UN Dept country offices engaged in supporting national civil registration and national ID schemes, as well as contributing to the UN's policy on civil registration, national identity schemes, privacy, data protection, and regulating the use of biometric technologies. Much more I could say about Niall, but I'll let him pop in a few more bits maybe later when he speaks to himself. Bhreithimh then is Communications Officer with the UNHCR's representation for EU affairs in Brussels, and she's previously served with the UNHCR in Dakar, Senegal, and Arusha in Tanzania. So I'm sure she'll have lots to share with us about how, I suppose, international your career can be with the UN. Also joined by my own colleague, Ciarán Murray, who is our own Grad Jobs Manager and Events and Operations Manager in European Movement Ireland. Ciarán manages all of our EM Ireland events, which is a big job these days with our online events, and our Grad Jobs in Europe programme. And I'll tell you a little bit about that later if you'd like to know more or be kept up to speed with the EU job opportunities as they arise. Ciarán himself was a Schumann stagiaire in DG Finance in the European Parliament, so he might be able to share a bit about that and his own personal experience later too. My name is Lisa Bhreithimh, and I am Head of Communications and Education with European Movement Ireland. And we are, of course, an organisation that works to develop the connections between Ireland and Europe and to achieve greater public understanding and engagement with the European Union and with our European partners. And we are a membership-based organisation and always welcome new individuals and organisations to join us in our important work across Europe. So you can learn more about European Movement Ireland or become a member at europeanmovement.ie. And so in EM Ireland, as I mentioned, we have a far-reaching and busy, Ciarán will tell you, EU jobs programme, working alongside the Department of Foreign Affairs for the past 14 years to inform, encourage and provide guidance to any of you and others who are interested in pursuing a career in the EU. We do one-to-one career clinics, career talks in universities, now all online as well, of course, and we share a weekly jobs newsletter with all of the opportunities that are available in any one week. We also publish the Green Book, which is an A to Z guide for anyone interested in working in the EU institutions and agencies. So you can sign up to that jobs list or connect with us for more information, again, at europeanmovement.ie. You'll also, many of you may be aware that the government recently launched the new EU job strategy with ourselves. You can watch that launch back on our EMI player too, and download that strategy indeed if you wish to have a read through it at dfa.ie/EU jobs. And this was after, of course, a call out for submissions from individuals and organisations across all sectors of Irish society and indeed in Brussels and further afield too. So there are lots of ambitious goals and targets laid out there to increase representation of Irish people at EU level in the institutions, agencies and more broadly too. My own passion, if there's anyone else out there, when it comes to EU jobs, is with the Irish language side of things. And so I can provide advice to anyone who's interested in learning more about the Irish language side of everything with EU jobs, or indeed tá fáilte roimh ceistena in Gaeilge, so Q&A and chin freshen. So with all this in mind, it's timely that we're here today to get advice from our colleagues in the UN, where there are such a broad number of opportunities and variety of opportunities for Irish people and indeed people right across the world, across the member state organs and the Secretariat, including bodies such as the Human Rights Council and the Secretariat departments in New York. I think it's fair to say a UN career could be absolutely anywhere in the world, which is an exciting element of it too. And of course, the agencies, funds and programs such as UNICEF and the World Health Organization, and so on and so forth. So lots of really important things happening, which you'll hear more about shortly. And our speakers will tell you how to apply, all of the different factors to consider, I suppose the when, where, all of the links, and of course, everything from language abilities right down to your social media profiles and planning ahead for this as a career opportunity. We'd love to hear your questions, and indeed some of you have been ahead of the mark and sent in questions to us in advance. So just to say, if you have any questions, don't be hasty, pop them in the Q&A function just to be sure we can get to them. We have a lot on our list already, so get your questions in early to be sure we can get to them, and we'll aim to have you all out the door, metaphorically speaking, by 6 o'clock. And be sure to join us on social media as well with any of your questions and comments. You'll find us across platforms at EM Ireland, or of course at UN in Brussels. So I'm going to pass over, without further ado, to Niall and Saorlaith, who will give you a comprehensive overview of the various opportunities available. And then after that, my colleague Ciarán will lead a Q&A. Niall and Saorlaith, I'll pass over to yourselves.
Thanks a lot, Lisa. Thanks a lot, Ciarán. Greetings from Brussels, everybody. Saorlaith and I have 6 slides here this evening. I'm going to do 3. Saorlaith is going to do 3 also, and I will do slides 1 and 2. To get into it straight away, when we talk about recruitment or building a career or trying to get a job at the UN, let's just clarify first exactly what do we mean by the UN. I've seen organograms, people try to draw the United Nations, and it kind of looks like spaghetti. There's so many lines moving in all sorts of different directions, but largely we have 3 main branches of the United Nations. So the first branch would be what we would term to be the member state organs of the UN. Those would be largely, the most famous would be the General Assembly and the Security Council. Those would be the 2 member state organs of the UN that people would have heard of probably the most. Ireland, of course, currently sitting on the Security Council, but there are other major member state organs as well, like the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, and indeed the Geneva headquartered Human Rights Council. All of those member state organs, they have secretariat bodies supporting them that actually conduct recruitment. Within this, what is referred to as the Secretariat of the UN, for example, based in New York, there are a number of departments. Those would include the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, the Department of Peace Operations, the Department of Field Support, the Department of Safety and Security. So if you hear somebody saying they work for the UN Secretariat, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, it's largely going to be in one of those New York-based or Geneva-based secretariat departments. But the vast amount of recruitment and the vast amount of people that work for the United Nations work for what is termed the agencies, funds and programs. Now, if you go on Wikipedia under the UN, there is literally dozens of these agencies, funds and programs. In fact, some of these agencies, funds and programs, many people may not even realize are in fact UN agencies. The more well-known, the more high profile, the more famous agencies would include UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund, and indeed where Saorlaith works, the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR. I'm in UN Development Programme, but of course then we have major organizations like the World Health Organization, the World Food Programme, and all of these are specialist agencies of the UN. And indeed there's others, like I said, the International Telecommunications Union, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and indeed agencies such as the International Civil Aviation Organization that I've mentioned here, ICAO, who do lots of work around things like, you know, setting technical standards for passports and other work areas like that. That's the second branch. The third main branch of the UN would also be sometimes quite high-profile bodies of the UN, which would be what we would call special political missions, and of course the peacekeeping missions. Some of the more well-known peacekeeping missions would obviously be in an Irish context at UNIFIL, where Irish soldiers have been on mission for many, many decades. And other more high-profile ones would include MONUSCO in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But alongside the peacekeeping missions, there are also a number of special political missions, which is largely kind of a similar thing to a peacekeeping mission without the soldiers. These would be bodies of the UN set up for a specific purpose and a specific time frame by a resolution, usually of the Security Council, oftentimes or almost exclusively, in fact, in a conflict or a post-conflict environment where the UN has been given a mandate to carry out specific tasks, and that may involve disarmament, for example, reintegration of warring parties or ex-combatants into society, organization of elections, political dialogue, etc. Those can be in-country missions, such as UNAMA that I've mentioned there, the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, or indeed they can be what would be termed non-resident special envoys. President Mary Robinson, for example, was the special envoy for the Great Lakes region for a number of years. And all of those peacekeeping, special political missions, special envoy offices also have support staff that are recruited for that purpose to work for those missions. And we will come back to that later. But it was interesting just to point out what we really refer to when we talk about three branches of the UN. So the next slide. I think it is also important to note that largely when we talk about UN recruitment, we're talking about three more or less types of contract. There are staff posts, staff positions. That would be the majority of people. But there are also a huge amount of consultancies where consultants are recruited to carry out specific activities for specific UN bodies. And then, of course, there are internships and volunteers, etc. And we just thought it would be interesting in terms of staff, the actual staff positions in the UN, to literally go from the very, very top of the organization down so that you can situate where entry-level staff posts, graduate-level staff posts, or mid-career professionals fit in the overall organogram of things. And it is a little bit like the military, the UN. There are grades that kind of exist across the organization that would have the same status and stature across the organization. Or as we phrased it here, the staff grades are pretty much standardized across the entire system. So from the very, very top down, the Secretary General, as you know, former Prime Minister Antonio Guterres, appointed by the General Assembly upon the recommendation of the Security Council, but the SG selects his own, and unfortunately it has always been a he, selects his own Deputy Secretary General, who is currently Nigerian British diplomat Amina Mohammed. But the grade underneath that then, there's actually about 50 people that have the grade under Secretary General, and those people are also appointed by the Secretary General, but this is often a political horse trading between member states. And for example, there is a rank of Under Secretary General that is in charge of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, for example. That has been an American position for the last number of years now. I think we're on our fourth successive American Under Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. We are on our fourth or fifth successive British Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. We are on our fourth or fifth successive French Under Secretary General for Peacekeeping. And to show you and give you an example of just how senior or high profile this grade in the UN is, the last Irish person to have the grade of Under Secretary General was President Mary Robinson when she was both, when she was the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and then later, as I said, the Special Envoy for the Great Lakes region. The grade below Under Secretary General is called Assistant Secretary General. There's probably somewhere in the region of 200 to 250 UN officials with that title. These people are oftentimes ex-government ministers or other pretty senior diplomats, and that often act as deputies basically to the Under-Secretaries General. At the moment, Ireland has got a couple of Assistant Secretary General ranked people, probably the most well-known of which would be the former Commissioner of the Garda Síochána, Noreen O'Sullivan in New York, who is the ASG in the Department of Safety and Security. Next, Ciarán. As you can see, that level of post, you don't just get to be an ASG or a USG in the UN. And to be very, very honest about it, you're only ever going to get to that position with major political support and major political lobbying from your home government. These really are very, very senior political appointee posts, and therefore I would say possibly, unfortunately, not necessarily within the scope or the range or the ambition for, certainly for me, of a lot of people on this call tonight. But below those grades then are really where we come to some of the core staffing positions within the United Nations. The next grade below ASG would be referred to as Director 2 or D2, and these people are often bureau or division directors. These are also quite senior diplomatic and political posts. And to give you an example again, nationality can play a large role here. So for example, within Political and Peacebuilding Affairs in New York, there would be an Africa division. Well, the director of the Africa division is always going to be African. There would be an Americas division. The director of that division is always going to come from Latin America. The European division will always be a European. So again, nationality and senior political experience and diplomatic experience plays a very, very important role at that level. Below Director 2, Director 1, these are often unit directors, team directors, or indeed specialists that would have a lot of very, very high level technical skills, such as senior economists. The Human Development Index report, for example, that UN Dept manages has a number of senior economists that are hired to conduct a lot of major economic analysis, econometric analysis, and those people would be at the director level. I'm thinking at the moment of Irish people in those grades, somebody like Michael Ryan in the World Health Organization that would be very, very well known. I imagine Michael is probably a D2. And as you can see, again, given their seniority, you wouldn't get a post like that with the political backing of your home country, but sometimes it can help a lot in terms of recruitment for these posts. Now, below that, and these are all the really, really senior posts. Next, what we have, what we call the professional grade posts. And there's 4 grades here, from P5 down to P4, down to P3, down to P2. To be honest with you, an awful lot of international staff working in the UN system work at these grades. Myself and Saorlaith are at these grades. And these are grades that can be all manner of a job title, all manner of a job role. A lot of the times they have titles like policy advisor, policy specialist in the UNHCR context, you know, protection officers and UNICEF child protection officers, communication specialists, etc. And these are the positions that are generally openly recruited, where people, anybody, including people on this call tonight, can apply. And this would be the level where, frankly, if you wanted to build a career in the United Nations, this is largely where you're going to be. Below professional level grades, we have what are termed the general level grades. These would largely be administrative support staff, etc., in what we would refer to as the field in the 150 odd countries around the world where the UN is present. You would have a number of general level grades, G7, G6, G5, etc., of support staff, many of whom would be nationals of that country, but sometimes can also be international grade staff. Now, if you work in Ireland, for example, the UN has a representative office in Ireland, it's likely that there's general level grade staff working in that office there. And then there's one more grade below that, which would be called service contracts. Again, these would largely be administrative support type staff. So these are the various grades and the levels of the UN staffing system. And you can have, for example, a P3 post in UN Dept where I work, and that is roughly considered the same grade, the same level as a P3 post in the UN Refugee Agency where Saorlaith works. And I'll now hand over to her for the next couple of slides.
Thanks, Niall, for that overview. Just to maybe touch a little bit on general staff and so on, for you to be aware that whilst many of them are for nationals of the country in question, with the EU we do have some flexibility. So you could be a G staff, an Irish G staff in Belgium because of the European Union. And then as Niall mentioned, the professional staff, also known as international posts, they go from P2 to P5. Just by way of a barometer, P2 is 2 years or more, so more of a junior level. P3 is 5 years, considered mid-career. P4 is 7 years, also mid-career, and then P5 is a minimum of 10 years and considered senior level. To note that it will say P2 minimum of 2 years, very often you need to have more than 2 years. It's quite competitive, and very often we would see P2s with maybe 5 or 6 years experience under their belt and applying for that level. But once you're in, you can move up the system as you wish. In terms of permanent appointments, or these are largely being phased out across the organizations. So some funds, programs and agencies still do offer them. But most staff would be what we call FTA, fixed term appointment, or TA, temporary appointment. There is an increased use of rotation or mobility policies or relocation of posts. Just to give you an example, on the rotation side, UNHCR does have a rotation policy. After a certain period of time, a time that we call a standard assignment length, you are required to rotate within your agency. And that standard assignment length, or a SAL as we call it, very much depends on where you are. So to give you an example, here in Brussels, it's 5 years. If you were to go to somewhere, maybe a conflict zone, it could be around 18 months. Then we have duty stations that are graded. They are graded from A to E. And also H. So H is headquarters, so Geneva, New York, and so on. A would be somewhere like Panama, and E would be somewhere like Kabul. So you will spend longer SAL in Panama and a shorter SAL in Kabul. And obviously Kabul, very close to point of delivery of service. So that experience is really, really valuable within the system. And perhaps we can talk a little bit more about hardship and that later on. Master's degrees are usually required for D level and P level posts. However, if you do have quite a number of years of experience after your BA, that can sometimes compensate. And really, unfortunately, there is no central recruitment portal. This link here will help signpost you somewhat, but we can talk through a few more of those maybe in the next slide to help you through. So some of the recruitment pages are just here. It's just to give you a flavour of what's out there, just to note that whilst the UN is present in many countries across the world, its headquarters can very often be situated in different cities. So UNICEF, for example, the second on the list is New York, UNDP also New York, UNHCR Geneva, WFP World Food Programme is Rome, UNESCO is Paris, and then the last link is INSPRA, which is the UN Secretariat, which is in New York. Also to mention then that there are regional bureaux that would support all of these organizations, funds and programs, and they would be situated very much in large cities across the region. So for UNHCR, for example, it's Nairobi, Dakar, Pretoria, Panama, Bangkok and Amman. And then obviously they are supporting the country offices within those regions. It's worth following these organizations on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Twitter. Very often they advertise there. There can be short turnaround time in some instances. So it's good to follow them on your social media channels or to set up an alert and so on. I think UNESCO does have an email, a weekly email whereby they update on opportunities within their offices around the world, but I'm not so sure about the others. And maybe just to mention that some people move between different branches in the system, but many people would stay with the one agency. But there is some secondment within the system. Next slide, please, Ciarán. Thank you. Myself and Niall were talking about different kinds of entry points for younger and mid-career professionals, and we were mindful as well that maybe not everyone on the call is Irish, because sometimes your nationality does does play a role. The first thing to say would be to just always apply directly to posts that are advertised. It can take time. Sometimes there is a very detailed portal that has to be populated. There can be a CV template that can be a little bit awkward, a cover letter and so on. So do have your CV ready to copy and paste into the various portals. Junior professional officers, this is a program that's not unfortunately open at the moment for Irish people. JPOs would usually be recruited by way of bilateral agreements between the UN and donor countries. So Ireland would be a donor country, but so would France and Germany. The JPOs are usually nationals from the donor country. However, some donor countries do provide JPO opportunities for those living in developing countries. Candidates are largely young professionals with an advanced university degree and a minimum of 2 years experience. So they're usually around the P1 or the P2 level. We're seeing less and less P1s across the system. They're a little bit rare at the moment. The second point there is UNV or UN Volunteers. This is a program that's administered by UNDP, and UNV works in partnership with other funds, programs and agencies. There are approximately 9,000 UNDPs deployed worldwide, and they are a really, really fantastic opportunity to get field experience and to get experience inside the UN. I think every UN staff member has worked with UNVs down to their career. On many occasions, they are in every office and they are given great exposure to frontline service provision, but also to policy making and liaison with national authorities and donors. Whilst they are volunteers, they're not paid per se. It is a stipend that they receive. And on the back of that, there is an IUNV program, which is hosted by Irish Aid, part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Foreign Affairs and Trade. To the best of my knowledge, they roll these out annually. There is usually 10 or so positions, and they're also a good opportunity to engage in the UNV program. The third example of UNVs, and I'll hand over to Niall, are the online UNVs. Do you want to say a few words on those, Niall? You're quite familiar with them.
Thanks a lot, Saorlaith. And let me also echo, by the way, the point Saorlaith made about the UN volunteer program. I cannot say enough about it. I've been a recruiter and have recruited a number of UNVs over the years, and we have sent young people, 25, 26 years of age, into very, very rural parts of Sierra Leone, Liberia, in my own case when I was working there. And the amount of experience that can be gained is just invaluable with the UN volunteer program. And one thing that UNV really does take care of people with, for example, is things like vaccinations, visas, a lot of these very, very practical points that you might otherwise be worried about. You can be very well looked after in the UNV program. And the UNV program, like Saorlaith mentioned, has an online branch also. So if you go to onlinevolunteering.org, you will see opportunities that anybody aged over the age of 18 can actually undertake for the UN. And yes, it is completely voluntary, but right now at the moment, for example, I've got a couple of online volunteers working on my project doing things like translating a document from English to Spanish or English to Portuguese or whatever, because we need to publish it in those languages. And things like graphic design, IT skills or whatever are oftentimes largely invaluable. And yes, it is a cheap form of labor for the UN, let's not lie about this, but honestly, in terms of experience people can gain, it's quite invaluable. And in particular, when it comes to incredibly competitive recruitments that the UN must undertake, somebody showing that they have done some online volunteer work with the UN can be quite invaluable in terms of proving experience. Back to you, Saorlaith.
Thanks, Niall. So the YPP, or the Young Professional Programme, it's a programme that's opened up to certain nationalities. To the best of my knowledge, Ireland hasn't been on the list for the last few years, but it certainly might make a reappearance in the coming years. It's an initiative for those wishing to recruit to work in the UN Secretariat, so New York, but also the regional commissions, which are based in Addis, Geneva, Bangkok, Beirut, and Santiago. And there is like an entrance exam or an examination at the start, and for those who make it through that, they become part of this young professional program. We see quite a few of these in the system as well. and very often they migrate to other parts of the UN. So it's a program that's definitely worth following closely. Internships then, including in the field. I mean, we have an impression that internships are, you know, these unpaid experiences. For UNHCR, internships are paid, and I believe they're paid across the UN. There is a stipend. It's not a salary per se. And for internships that are in the field, again, you can have huge exposure. If you're in a small office, you can have huge experience, exposure, and you can learn a lot through these kinds of opportunities. Rosters also exist, and just to give you an example of how UNHCR uses that, we have what we call a talent pool. If you take a look at our website, you will find that. They're identifiable usually by a very distant deadline. So the talent pool deadlines for UNHCR expire at the very end of the year, so 31st of December. And they go across all roles within the organisation, from finance to development support, programmatic support, project control, livelihoods, communications, and so on. So they provide a really good opportunity to engage in the work with UNHCR. If you apply for one of these talent pools, your application will be screened by UNHCR colleagues in Budapest, and then you will be informed whether you've made it into the talent pool. And then as opportunities open, short-term opportunities, temporary appointments, you may be approached for interview and written exam. So it's a good one to have, and it's a good one to look into as well. The UN Office for Project Services, UNOPS, they support with the implementation of projects across the UN. So again, working very closely like UNV with funds and programs. And agencies like UNHCR, they would be very common in many offices, and it's good to keep an eye out for them. They have their own website, as you can see there, where they advertise. Consultancies then, maybe just to mention that there's no one database for consultancies across the UN, unfortunately. So it would be important to look at applying for these kinds of rosters, and maybe following on LinkedIn and so on. So that's just something to be mindful of. And should you be finding it difficult to have that initial break into the UN, it's worth looking at organizations that work very closely with the UN, in particular in multilateral hubs, so Geneva and New York, and that way you get exposure to the multilateral setting, working with the UN, and that can help then in terms of job applications down the track. Next slide, please. Over to you again, Niall.
Just a couple of tips here, general advice, colleagues, on languages. As you can imagine, I mean, to work for the UN in Francophone Africa, you're just not going to get a post if you can't work in French. And in the UN system, the 6 official working languages: French, Spanish, English, Arabic, Chinese, and Russian. And in a UN context, those are the languages. Okay, and it's kind of unfortunate because in the UN context then, it makes languages such as German or Italian kind of useless. Even if you work for the UN in a large city where the UN has an awful lot of offices like Vienna, German is not going to be a requirement to work there, because only English would be the working language in Vienna, and it would be the same then for Rome. So outside of the 6 major languages, I would say the only other language that has some kind of currency in the UN would be Portuguese, because the UN has large working programs in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and Timor-Leste, where really you would be expected to speak and work in Portuguese, even if Portuguese is not an official language. Now, one thing that's important to note about languages also, I've mentioned Spanish and Russian here for a couple of reasons. Obviously, for example, in the former Soviet space, the UN is very, very active in many countries like Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, etc. So, of course, you're going to be expected to be able to speak Russian there. And there are not that many Russian speakers out there in the international development community. When it comes to Spanish, Spanish is invaluable for a couple of reasons, not just because of the amount of work that the UN does in Latin America, but there's another sensitive kind of political point here, which is sort of relevant for French as well. And that's oftentimes that national governments or the national counterparts working with the United Nations side by side, sometimes, and to be quite honest with you, might express a view that, okay, fine, we are perfectly happy with the UN sending international staff to work here on a project, but they might openly say, I can't speak for UNHCR, but in the UNDP context, we would regularly be told, I'm sorry, no French people, no British people, no Spanish people in Latin America. And this would be for kind of obvious reasons. So if you're not from those countries, but you're able to speak those languages and work in those languages, then that can be an advantage. When it comes to education, as we've mentioned, master's degrees really are the currency, and it is difficult. Although it's possible, as Saorlaith mentioned, to get a professional level post with a BA only, a BA plus years experience, in many cases, a hiring manager wanting to hire somebody only with a BA plus years working experience is going to have to justify why they're recommending that person over possibly very, very well qualified people with master's degrees. So master's degrees really are the currency for professional grades and above. But ironically, it isn't necessarily the subject matter of your master's degree that's most important, or where you actually qualified for your master's degree. And I have been in cases watching the Political Affairs Department in New York, for example, recruiting people, and all they're really interested in is, does that person have a master's degree? And whether it's a master's degree that cost a couple of €1,000 in Ireland, or a master's degree that cost $60,000 in the United States, they're both kind of considered the same because they're both master's degrees, and they won't necessarily even need to be in the subject matter of that is under recruitment. So we have seen people working as political affairs officers that have master's degrees in the life sciences. And when it comes to something like PhDs, realistically in the UN system, PhDs are only usually required or even valued in core specialist life sciences. Like the World Health Organization would be hiring a lot of people with PhDs. But I can tell you now, in UN Development Program where we work, there really is very, very few people with PhDs. A general piece of advice, which kind of goes beyond, I think, a lot of UN recruitment, would be the whole issue about getting in the door. A lot of people sometimes might feel, I'm not accepting an entry-level post. I studied too many years. I got too many academic qualifications to be accepting posts that are beneath me. I think the general advice from Saorlaith and myself would be, if you get the, if working for the United Nations is something that you really, really want to do, be prepared to accept entry-level posts if you feel that you're overqualified. Because once you are in the door, it is so much easier then to advance. And it's also so much easier to hear about other opportunities that might not necessarily be openly recruited, or might be recruited via rosters that you're not necessarily on, but that you can then get on, etc. A general point here about what are termed family duty stations. The UN has a list of countries that it works in, and some are considered family duty stations and some are not. In other words, you may be, as a mid-career person coming into the UN in your 30s, 40s, or 50s, you might be married with a family, and you may be asking the very obvious question, well, can I bring my family members to the country where I'm going to be working for the UN? And if that country is considered a family duty station, then you can. And if it's not considered a family duty station, then you cannot. And that means you will not get a visa for your family members if it's considered a family duty station. And unfortunately, there is a point here to be made that is certainly, I know, has affected staff trying to work for UNDP. Some countries, and this is a hard political reality, unfortunately, even when you get a job with the UN to work in a particular country, you still need to have a visa issued by that host country. Now, the UN will handle that visa application process for you. But in the case, I know of some staff that are married to same-sex partners, and the government, the host government, where that job is based, say, we do not recognize same-sex marriage, unfortunately, so therefore we will not issue a visa for your spouse in this regard. Hardship posts, there was a question that came in about how are hardship posts graded, or what would be the advice on that. All we can say on this is that there's no, even though there is a list, an official list of family duty station, non-family duty station, the term hardship posts and what are considered hardship countries does vary across the UN system, and there is no formal list. But you can imagine a lot of the countries that would be considered hardship, the obvious cases, Afghanistan, Libya, Democratic Republic of Congo, etc. These would be considered hardship duty locations. And when it comes to recruitment within the UN, we have in UNDP, for example, offices in countries like Barbados, the Cape Verde Islands, the Seychelles. Unsurprisingly, UNDP does not have a problem filling jobs in those countries. UNDP has a major problem filling jobs in Afghanistan for kind of obvious reasons. And so one piece of general advice would be, if you are young, if you really want to work for the UN, if you are really committed to this career, then do note that when you see jobs advertised in countries like Afghanistan, there are going to be less applicants than there are for countries where living conditions, frankly, are an awful lot easier. And it's something to keep in mind. The only reason we mention danger pay is that it can be paid in contexts like the Afghanistan's as well. Social media, please be careful on this. The UN does not formally, hiring managers do not formally troll somebody's social media history and try and see have they said anything stupid over the years or that they shouldn't have said. But please note that there are a lot of jobs in the UN that are what we would call project posts, and meaning they are funded by particular donors for particular project purposes. My post, for example, here in Brussels, I am fully funded by Switzerland for the last couple of years because I'm implementing a project that the Swiss government funds. And I cannot say whether donors, the people that may at the end of the day be consulted about the type of person that the UN is going to hire, I cannot say that the donor doesn't look through somebody's social media history. And if you have what would be generally considered fairly out there or extreme political statements on your social media that may be brought to the attention of donors, major actors in the UN, yes, it potentially may hurt you in terms of your career prospects or your recruitment prospects for that particular post. And next. It is an important point to make on disabilities recruitment. Many UN bodies, they've made commitments around recruitment of persons with disabilities. Frankly, it's easy to make commitments sometimes to say, yes, we will hire people with physical and indeed with psychosocial disabilities. It's possibly a little bit more difficult to actually implement. There's certainly no quotas of any kind in this regard. And it is going to be difficult for some people with disabilities in certain country contexts because particular facilities may not be that readily available. There have also been some commitments that UN bodies have made around recruiting religious minorities or gender minorities, and by gender minorities, I also mean gender identity minorities. That's a difficult one to police in many respects because people obviously are never asked in the course of a template of a CV, are you a member of a gender identity minority, for example? And people oftentimes don't feel the need and don't want to advertise that fact either. So it is in fact difficult sometimes for the UN in the context of a recruitment of a particular post to know that somebody may be a member of a particular community, and therefore it's difficult to judge how the UN may be successfully recruiting people from particular types of minorities. Just before we end, I wanted to add another point about age. There used to be a minimum age entry level for a lot of UN bodies, even for the UN volunteer program that used to be 26. It's now back down to 18, and which is good. At the other end of the life cycle, 61 is the oldest age you can be to enter the UN as a staff member. But for consultancies, there are no age limits or upper age limits. And in fact, I personally know I know a gentleman who's 84 years of age, still working on a long-term consultancy contract with the UN.